And good morning, good evening, and good night. Are you up? Are you still up? Or are you going to bed? Or are you in the middle of your day? Wherever you are, I'm happy that you're joining me and us and you. This is Scheff on the Myths of Science. We're phoning it in late night tonight because of some scheduling, some interesting things happening with scheduling. You don't need to know what they are. It's a need-to-know basis, and you don't need to know. Or maybe you do. Yeah, I'm just getting some things ready. I'll be on the road a little bit, doing some work hither and yon. This is an exciting show. I promoted it as such. You're going to be listening to an interview that I did today with a woman who I know, or I've gotten to know, who was recently diagnosed as HIV positive. You will also hear that she was then diagnosed as HIV negative. I will let her tell the story without further ado.
We're going to keep your name and your actual identity off the record, but what can you tell the listeners about yourself that wouldn't be too incriminating?
Well, I have a PhD in clinical psychology, and I am actively practicing in my field. And last month I had scheduled my regular gynecological exam that I have every year. And at that point, I had wanted to get an STD test, a full STD test, as I was considering entering a new relationship, and I just simply wanted to be able to show that I have a clean bill of health. To my knowledge, there had certainly been no exposure or any reason for me to be concerned that I had any form of STD, but it was important to me to share that with my prospective partner. So that is actually how the STD testing came about.
You actually requested an HIV test specifically.
Yes, I did specifically request the test, and when I did so, my doctor actually asked me, well, do you have any specific reason for asking to be tested? And I said, well, I ended a relationship some months ago, and I would like to enter a new one, and I want to be certain that I can show my prospective partner that I'm safe.
And then what happened?
So the following day after my exam, I received a phone call from my doctor's office from a nurse. And she asked me to come back into the office in order to go over my lab results. And I thought that was very suspicious because, of course, I knew what I was being tested for. I knew that certainly could not be good news. The nurse certainly did not want to reveal the reasons why I was being called back into the lab, so I pushed her a few times, and I said, the only conclusion I can come up with based on your phone call is that I'm HIV positive. And the nurse responded by saying, I'm not supposed to share this with you. And I said, ma'am, I'm going to be up all night thinking about this. Would you please give me a chance to prepare myself and ask appropriate questions tomorrow? Would you please confirm for me if that is indeed what the situation is? And the nurse responded, yes, you have a reactive test. We have to do a Western blot follow-up, but you do have a reactive test. And, of course, I was in shock, and I said, ma'am, are you certain? I said, I am in one of the most low-risk groups you can possibly imagine. And I said, this is just an extraordinary shock to me. And she said, well, the doctor will go over all of this with you tomorrow. We will wait on a confirmatory Western blot, but your initial screener is reactive. Have you had any exposure that you know of? And I was going, no, ma'am, I have no exposure. I'm very concerned about this result. And she just told me to bring someone with me tomorrow for support. So the following morning, I did meet with my physician. I brought with me the gentleman I was dating to also lend support and perhaps ask the questions I wasn't thinking of asking. I would not think to ask under such circumstances. And of course, I'm anxious. I'm confused. It was just surreal to me. I just could not imagine that this was actually happening to me. And the doctor shared with me that not only was my initial screener, my ELISA, positive, but that I had also received a positive Western blot. And she showed me the lab work, and of course I didn't pay near the attention to it that I wish I would have at that time. I simply looked at the paperwork, and my recollection, which may be incorrect, was that there were 2 positive bands on the Western blot. I can't remember specifically which ones, but I said, are you quite certain about this? I am very low risk. And she said, yes, this is a highly specific, highly sensitive test. I wouldn't have any other explanation for this.
You know your own history. When you say you're very low risk, you mean to say you've had no partners, that you've had we're keeping this anonymous, but you've shared very, very few partners, none of them having come up and told you that they were positive. You racked your brain. Did you go and call everybody? I mean, what was your instinct? Did you go back through your history? And
yeah, I think it's important for me to be fairly specific on this point. What I do know is that I've had very few partners. They have been within the context of long-term relationships. I've known them to be blood donors. And the one partner I had who was not a long-term relationship, there had been condom use. So, and I had never used any form of intravenous drugs. Again, it was just a very low risk, as I understand the risk factors. I would be perceived as very low risk. So that is why I knew that to be very suspicious of this to begin with.
And yet, let's be honest, how did it affect you? Emotionally, psychologically?
You know, it was very interesting. As a psychologist, I've worked with many people who have had, life-threatening diagnoses, and I know all of these things clinically, but emotionally, there was no preparing myself for the shock and the horror and I don't know how else to explain it except extraordinary sense of isolation that came along with this. Because again, the meaning and the context of HIV has such a strong cultural construct to it. There is a strong social and cultural construct around HIV that in my mind was far more devastating than the actual medical prognosis for me. I certainly have accepted that we all have an expiration date and I won't live forever, and if I don't die from one thing, I'll die from another thing. And I'm in pretty good health, good condition, and I figured I could take care of myself physically and do things to keep myself fairly healthy, because a lot of people live now with this quote-unquote diagnosis. But again, emotionally, the impact was, how do I look at myself now? Who am I sexually? Who am I in terms of being a potential partner or marriage partner or friend to somebody? Am I dangerous to people I love? Am I dangerous to people I could love? I sat in that office and had a full-blown panic attack when she shared this information with me. And I don't know how else to say it except that I shook and I cried, and for about a week I could hardly get myself out of the house and go about living. And I'm a person with a lot of social support and a lot of people who love me, and who would have supported me through this entire process, but it was just devastating.
This is Liam Scheff. Again, we are talking with Madeline. She's a clinical psychologist, PhD, working in her field. She recently was given an HIV-positive test diagnosis, but that's not the end of the story. Here's where I have to declare my interest. We actually know each other through a friend, and at that point I said, well, hold on, you have a lot of reading to do, and I proceeded to send you hundreds of pages of reading, quite literally hundreds of pages of reading on HIV tests, some of it from peer-reviewed literature, a lot of it from the medical literature, a lot of it citations from the medical literature. And I said, before you make any decisions, before you think you know what you're in, you have to understand the test you just took. Now, I've never actually asked you this, but what was it like for you to be presented with all of this this information that said, well, let me ask you, what did you see the information saying, and how did it affect you?
What I saw the information saying was that I'm not entirely sure at all what this test actually measures. What it suggested to me was that there are a lot of questions, many of which are still unanswered, about the actual specificity and sensitivity of this test, about the purification process that went around developing these HIV tests, and that there were just a lot of questions and issues that were not that are common, quote unquote, common knowledge in the literature put forth by the CDC, and that aren't necessarily valid. At least raised lots of questions for me about the validity of this diagnosis, about the link between HIV and AIDS, and again, just the whole sense of what actually are these tests measuring. And I'm no virologist. I mean, I have no background. I'm not a medical doctor. I don't have a strong chemistry background. I don't have an extraordinary biology background by any means. But again, there were just some common sense sorts of things that I really would want to discuss with a physician. Like, why are there at least 5 different standards for evaluating whether someone is positive just within the United States? Why is it that if the medical literature suggests that there's at least 70 different cross-reactions that can cause a false positive HIV test, why is that not discussed before someone actually takes this test? There were just so many questions that came up in my mind, and again, I was in a very emotional state as I was reading this literature and grappling with questions in my mind of, is this denial? You know, certainly I just received a diagnosis I would never in a million years want to have or want anybody else to have. Certainly I want to believe that I don't have this. I must just be in denial. And at the same time, there were some reputable peer-reviewed articles that suggest there is reason to question it. And I was a bit concerned that there was not a lot of recent literature that more called into the question the HIV diagnosis and the validity of that diagnosis. There were a few. But all the recent research on HIV that I could find was based on those early seminal articles. And if the reality is that the HIV virus has never actually been isolated, then I'm not sure that all the current research that suggests that HIV is a valid diagnosis and discusses the sensitivity and specificity of these tests, etc., I don't know how you can help but call into question those findings.
So you received this diagnosis, and you said you had a positive or a reactive, and it's very important. There's no plus or minus; they're just reactive to different degrees. ELISA test, and you said you weren't sure, but you thought there were 2 bands on the Western blot, and you mentioned that there's really no national standard for Western blot, and this was a concern to you. There's no international standard. You started poking into the Western blot, and I don't know if I should tee this off too much, but what happened? Did you bring this to your doctor, I should say?
I did not bring this information back to my doctor until I met with her the next time. And what had happened is 1 week after I had gone through what people go through when they get a devastating diagnosis like this, the anxiety, the sadness, the grief, the denial, the pain, the, oh my God, who do I tell, who do I not tell, how is this going to affect my life? 1 week later, I had a couple of phone calls from my doctor in the evening. And when I called her back, I thought she was just checking on me, or even worse, I thought she was going to call me and say, we got your viral load back, and we need you to come in tomorrow morning and start treatment. We need to do something right away. I was just expecting this really bad news. And what my doctor said instead was, what would you do if I told you that you were actually HIV negative? And my response to that was, well, it certainly wouldn't surprise me, doctor. I hope to schedule an appointment with you tomorrow because I am having a lot of trouble making sense of this diagnosis in light of what I've read of the research and of the data. And she explained to me that because she recognized that I was fairly low risk and that I had shared with her that there would be no reason to believe that any of my partners had been HIV positive, given that they get blood, given that I had been tested just a few years ago as part of an insurance policy, etc. Given that information, she ran additional tests, actually 2 additional tests. One of those additional tests was with the original blood sample, and the next set of tests was taken from our next meeting when she told me that I was HIV positive in person, and went ahead and took the blood for what I understood to be the CD4s and the viral load. So on the subsequent 2 tests that she gave me, or that she ran on me, they both came back positive for the ELISA screener, but they both came back negative on the Western blot. There were no 0 bands lit up on the Western blot on the subsequent 2 runnings of those tests. And she indicated that she thought it was a laboratory error. And she said I could certainly come in for a 3rd test if I wanted to, but she felt pretty confident at that point that I was not HIV positive. Of course, I'm shocked, I'm amazed, I'm happy, I'm making phone calls. I'm not questioning her heavily at that point. The next morning, my doctor had given me her cell phone number, so the next morning after I had sort of made this transition from, okay, I have HIV, whatever that means, I'm not sure exactly what it means, but whatever it means, I have HIV, to, okay, I do not have HIV. And I somehow got a reprieve here, and by God, I want to prove it, and I want records of it. So I texted my doctor the next morning and asked her to actually, could I come by and get a copy of my medical records as well as a letter from her indicating that I am indeed HIV negative. And she texted me back, sure, come on out, I'm working at the hospital today, come on out, I'll meet you, I'll even bring it to your car. So I get to the hospital. She's not able to return my text at that time. I let her know I'm in the hospital cafeteria. So she comes down to the hospital cafeteria with my records in an envelope and meets me. And we talked for, I'm guessing, 30 to 45 minutes. Again, this is not a documented session happening in a doctor's office. This is happening in a hospital cafeteria. And she explained to me that she had contacted the lab and discussed with them that there was possibly a problem with the calibration on their machines. Because, again, my initial Western blot showed positive, and my subsequent 2 Western blots showed negative. And, of course, most standards in the United States show that if you have a positive ELISA and a negative Western blot, you're considered HIV negative because somehow the Western blot is supposed to be confirmatory. And I just had to ask her questions. How would I go from having a positive Western blot to a negative Western blot? Now, how does that happen? And again, there were problems with the calibrations in the machine in the lab. Was her explanation for that? I asked her if she knew and she understood how many different diseases can cross-react with these tests to create a positive result. And she said, lots of them. And we discussed other illnesses where that happens too, syphilis, etc. She was certainly aware that there were problems with false positives, and we even discussed at that point the fact that I had been diagnosed previously some years ago with Epstein-Barr, and the fact that just my immune system being activated in this way could have created this. And this would have been so helpful for me to know before I actually put myself through this test. And I even said, are you aware that there's a lot of question as to even whether this virus had ever been isolated? I said, as I'm reading this literature, I'm not even clear that this retrovirus has been isolated. And she said, well, yeah, Gallo is a crook. And of course, Gallo is one of the individuals who is credited with making the link between HIV and AIDS.
So if I can just say that the doctor at that point admits that there are many reasons for cross reactions, that the blame then is going to a calibration problem, and it's admitted that Gallo, whose research this entire field is based and predicated upon, is, quote, a crook. Do I have that right?
Yes.
And this is Liam Scheff. You're listening to The Myths of Science. This is an interview I did earlier today, or I suppose it was yesterday, even though we're just past midnight on the clock. True story. People in the press, people in investigating agencies can get in touch with me if they'd like to validate the story, if they'd like to verify the story. It's fine. You know how to do it. I am protecting this person's identity by her request. I'm fine with doing that. I've done it in the past. And I'm the only organization that doesn't understand keeping people's names anonymous. Apparently it's the New York Times when they want to slag you on the front pages. But if you want to find out at least how to get in touch with this person, if she's willing to speak with you and you're going to do a serious investigation of what she's explaining here, what she's explaining here is that she was given a positive HIV test, a positive follow-up test, and then pursued the issue with her physician, an educated woman with a PhD, clinical therapist working in her field at an advanced level, known to her doctor, is now considered not positive. Let's continue with the interview with the person we're calling Madeline.
Did you try to see the test that had 2 bands, or were you sure that it was 2 bands? Did you talk with the doctor about what's the difference between 2 bands and 3 bands, or band A, B, and C here, or D, E, and F here? Did you talk a little about the lack of standardization, and were you able to compare your 2 sets of results?
Well, no, we could not compare my 2 sets of results because my initial results are gone. There is no evidence in my medical records of my initial positive ELISA and positive Western blot. And I'll follow up in just a moment with your question about, I did certainly ask her about the positive bands, but let me just predicate this by saying that the original paperwork is gone. The original lab reports are not available. She didn't give them to me, and when I ordered my medical records on my own, they didn't exist. Now, she told me that the reason for that is that each time she ordered this test, unless she created a new encounter, it would bill my insurance. So she didn't want to bill my insurance each time she ran this test, and again, she ran it 3 times total. So the most recent result is the one that would pop up in the computer, and it would effectively eliminate any previous results, so that there would be no records of my initial positive Western blot.
You've also known this doctor for a while. You actually know each other as people. If I have that correct? So, and she knows you, and I believe when we were talking, you and I were talking, you said that she was suspicious because of knowing you. Was there any sense that the fact that she knew you and felt you to be, quote, at low risk, do you think that you were treated differently than the average, forgive me, but average junkie or average person going into an STD clinic to get a test? Do you think that you were given another chance because of who you are to the doctor, because of your education level, because you were able to articulate some concerns and able to use the clinical language a little, low risk, et cetera?
I certainly can't speak to what was going through her mind, but I can certainly say from my perspective, yes, I think that I would imagine I was treated differently. I need to point out that the clinic that I went to, I choose to go there because the physicians have a history of being very good, and because they're actively engaged in research, and you can access many other medical services there, so that's where I choose to go. It's also important to point out that most of the people who go to this clinic, most of them are people who don't have insurance resources, who are very high risk by the traditional standards, meaning they tend to use drugs, they may have multiple illnesses, they tend to have more sex partners, etc. They are in those traditional, quote-unquote, high-risk groups. And my personal belief, and again, not having proof, but my personal belief is, yeah, she knows me a little bit. She knows that I was very suspicious of this diagnosis to begin with. And I think she was diligent in following up with me because of those factors. I can't imagine that most people get the reprieve that I received from this. And I can say that it's very frightening that in the state where I live, it's pretty standard to test pregnant women for HIV. And you have to actually default or defer out of that. And there could be many women who go to this clinic, again, and this is being the free clinic for many women, who have received this diagnosis and who may be on antiretroviral treatments as we speak, who have received a false positive. For whatever this HIV diagnosis is or is not, and I certainly can't draw any great conclusions about that, they may not even be positive in the clinical sense.
Did the doctor express any concerns about, if this has been poorly calibrated, what does it mean for everybody else? I mean, was there any reflection on her part?
There was after I made a statement about it. I did say, if this happened to me, this could have happened to any of your patients. And she goes, yes, I know. I'm going to be going back through my files, and I'm going to be calling people back to retest because, this is very scary. And certainly she did not want anybody to be misdiagnosed, and she was talking about the time it was going to take for her to do this. And, of course, she can only speak to her behavior. She cannot speak to what other physicians through this particular place, how they will handle this, or even if they'll be notified. And, again, I didn't follow up with her about that in terms of what action will this larger practice take in checking with the lab and in checking their results, because there are several different clinics who I'm sure routinely employ HIV testing and that would use the same lab. So there's absolutely no guarantee that just because she would go back and recheck hers doesn't mean that other physicians would do the same when they use the same lab.
And I'll point out for my own purposes that even if she called everybody who was given a diagnosis, they're now going to bring them in. They're going to retest them with nonspecific antibody tests like ELISAs, and they're going to give them nonspecific antibody tests like Western blots, and I guess they'll assume those are more correct. The fact of the matter is they disposed somehow or another of your paperwork. So you wanted it, I suppose, for personal, professional, legal reasons to have this thing in your hand that said, yes, you gave me a positive diagnosis, you told me so, and now the paperwork's just gone, whoosh? It's just not there?
There's no documentation. And again, I'm not a medical doctor, and I'm not familiar with all medical procedures, nor do I pretend to be. However, in my field, and I would assume it would be similar in medical field, when you have an encounter with a patient, you document that. And I had specifically ordered records for every phone call, for every session I had with the physician, etc. There are no records of any of that. What there is in my medical record is a positive ELISA and a negative Western blot, positive ELISA, negative Western blot. There is one note to a nurse that says, please call the patient and ask her to come in so I can review her results. There is no documentation of the session in which I and the gentleman I was dating came in and received the HIV positive diagnosis. There's no record of that. There is no record of her phone call to me informing me that I am actually HIV negative. There is no record of any sort that shows that I met with her at the hospital, albeit the hospital cafeteria, and that she provided me with the medical records and that she provided explanation about my HIV diagnosis, my HIV negative diagnosis. There is nothing in my chart to that effect that I can find unless they failed to give me certain notes. It's not in there. So the original Western blot and ELISA are no longer available. In other words, I couldn't prove if I wanted to what happened to me, except from my experience and the experience of the gentleman who was with me during those sessions. And, of course, that's concerning. On a personal level, of course that's much more helpful to me. If an insurance company ever wants to investigate me or I want life insurance or health insurance, I'm not going to have to go through a big battle to prove that I'm negative because those records don't exist. However, from a public health policy standpoint, that's terrifying, and it's unconscionable to me.
Well, you work professionally in your field, your PhD in psychology, you've now encountered what I feel I generously call the HIV test fraud or HIV test rigamarole. I'm sure you see people who have this diagnosis. Is this going to change the way that you proceed in your work? Are you going to pursue this professionally? Or are you going to ask other therapists to look at these tests, having been through your experience?
This really called into question my trust of the agencies I've relied on so heavily for information over the years. It certainly called into question my trust for the CDC, National Institute of Health, et cetera. It's been very concerning to me, and certainly I am part of the establishment. I am part of the medical establishment. I am traditionally trained, and I work with physicians, et cetera. And I certainly see that I have been part of the problem in the past, because when I have worked with HIV-positive patients, I followed the same line that I have always heard from the CDC. If you have this diagnosis, an HIV-positive test equates with HIV infection. It's important for you to seek medical treatment, to follow doctor's orders, to inform your partners, etc. I have always followed that line and supported the medical framework for that. And again, working within the boundaries of my competence, I am not in a good position to evaluate all of this research, but I am in a good position to suggest to patients that they need to ask questions of their doctor about what these tests are, what they actually measure, to give them reading materials and to give them resources so they can make a balanced decision for themselves about how they want to proceed. And I've certainly shared information with my colleagues. I've shared several pieces of literature with my colleagues, some of the more recently published data and published papers on this. And they're shocked and horrified too. Again, these are psychologists, some of whom tend to be more in the health psychology field, so they're a little bit better able than me to sort out some of these issues. But certainly it's frightening that, to all of us, that we are making public policy decisions and treatment decisions based on what basically appears to be a nonspecific test for a nonspecific illness. And yes, this will change how I work with patients. I'm certainly not in a position to inform them medically what they should do or should not do, but I certainly think I can help them ask questions and to seek out additional resources.
Other reporting agencies and investigative agencies know they can get in touch with me if they want to get in touch with you to validate or verify your story, but whether you reveal your identity in the future will be up to you.
I appreciate very much the opportunity to talk with you and to share this experience, and I appreciate the work that you do.
And that's the end of the interview from today with a licensed clinical psychologist who recently discovered the world of HIV testing up close and personal. I happen to know her for acquaintances through a mutual friend, and I was more than happy to provide hundreds of pages of literature from the medical literature on HIV testing with a strong suggestion that it be read and considered before making any serious, committed decisions to take life-ending drugs, at least what the FDA calls black box label drugs, which Bono and Oprah call AIDS drugs, life-saving AIDS drugs. You see the intellectual split there from what's written in the subscript to what's posted on the advertisements. I don't know what I can add to that interview. She got tested as a matter of social responsibility. Sound familiar? She had no real risk exposure, that she was just perhaps cautious in her own life, maybe conservative. Who knows? I don't know. Given a positive result, the doctor said, these are very good tests. You have to trust us. She didn't trust them. She said, I'm not at risk. I don't understand this. She was reading the literature on HIV testing. The literature you can find it by looking up in the HIV test package insert, or you can look at two places we've accumulated it online. David Crow's Alberta Reappraising AIDS Society, or ARAS, aras.ca.ab. That's ARAS.ca for Canada, AB for Alberta. or reducetheburden.org, reducetheburden.org. There are many excellent health websites that now talk about the fraud, the giant stinking fraud of HIV testing. But you say, Liam, the system worked. She had a positive test, and then she had another positive test, and then after fussing about it for a week, thinking about loss and death and pain and probably suicide, which is what people think about at these points, the doctor called her after. She called the doctor many times and talked to the doctor about the fact that she didn't think she was in risk group, and the doctor said, well, I guess we made a mistake. Maybe the machine wasn't calibrated correctly. Do you think that that's a working system? And what's the difference between 2 stripes and 3 stripes, and stripes A, B, and C versus stripes C, B, and D versus stripes F, G, and A? Right? Who cares? Nobody. These tests come up positive. I don't know anything that they don't come up positive for, except that they don't come up positive for any one thing. And you can review the test literature and you can make that decision, because that's what they say. At present, there is no recognized standard for determining the absence, the presence or absence of antibodies to HIV in human blood. In other words, this isn't an HIV test. Now, take it if you're in a risk group. Would this woman have been retested so cautiously if she hadn't been well-educated, a PhD, forgive me, but a white woman? Would she have had the doctor be so cautious as to go back and say, well, I guess we've screwed up thousands of these things. After all these machines were recalibrated, do you think they're really going to go back and tell thousands of people that they're not really HIV positive? You really think so? Do you think that might make the papers? You can look for it in the newspaper. I don't think you're going to find it. This is Liam Scheff. You've been listening to The Myths of Science. HIV tests are a giant stinking myth. They're also a fraud, or they're a fraud and they're also a myth. AIDS, as an immune deficiency, is real enough. It's complex. It's multifactorial. It has no one cause. It certainly is not cured by giving people drugs that kill their livers, bone marrow, blood cells, stomachs, intestines, eyes, nose, face, ears, and toes. So we're going to have to look in a different direction, nevirapine and high doses of AZT given to pregnant women to cure immune deficiency. You can start by reconstituting the intestines, rebuilding the probiotic flora. You can start by making sure the person's producing good blood, and you don't want to suppress the production of blood with a drug like AZT. You can do a lot of things to help people get better from immune deficiency. But the first thing you have to do is know about HIV testing, and you have to talk to people about it. You have to pass on this episode. This is a woman who never would have encountered this world if she had not experienced it for herself, and I hope that eventually she is willing to come and talk on the record, but I'm grateful to her in any case for telling her story and sharing it with me, you, and everybody you know. Thanks for listening. We'll be back, God's willing, next week. I'll be on the road a bit. Hopefully things won't get too bumpy as I travel, and we'll be able to keep up the show schedule. Go to liamscheff.com, liamscheff.com. Yeah. Go check out the new videos on YouTube. We've got some great videos of Robert Scott Bell and another with just myself talking about history and conspiracy and why it's good to be a conspiracy realist. Don't kid yourself. The world demands it. And we will see you next week. No outro. You have to provide your own music. Dun, 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 dun. Bum. Thanks for listening. Music. Dun, 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 dun. Bum. Thanks for listening. Music. Dun, 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 dun.